They would have had a daughter. Indeed, it was a daughter she was carrying in her womb. Their house was being blasted by the weather of the season, and it would have been best to sit indoors. But who could afford to sit indoors while their house was being blasted by the autumn weather? Holger Nielsen would set out in the morning and return with the barley in the evening. She would fetch the water herself from the well, since it was located in the farmyard. She loathed her helplessness, and was incapable of just lying down at home, even though she ought to, now that she was carrying the baby in her womb. "It would be better if you lay down and rested in the house," Holger had told her. "A woman doesn't lie down and rest in the house just because she is expecting," Elizabeth had replied. The matter was settled, and she would fetch the water from the well in the farmyard, even though she probably should not have done so, as she was so exhausted and so close to childbirth that autumn in Ytre Åkulla. One evening when the rain was lashing down hard on the countryside, like the thrashing of an honest upbringing, there was a thumping on the door. This was not the sound of knocking, but most definitely of thumping, a mighty thumping. "Is it a stranger at the door?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes, alas, it certainly seems so," Holger said. "We aren't expecting any visitors." She was close to giving birth, and furthermore, she had a fever now, so Holger did not think she should move without due cause. They had heard that giving birth in a fever could end badly. The kitchen table was good enough for normal deliveries, but not for giving birth in a fever. If her temperature did not drop soon, they would not be able to have their child delivered at home, but would have to travel to the cottage hospital situated in Bugdeo. "Just you lie where you are, Elizabeth," he said, pressed her hand, and then opened the door. The thumps were coming from a man who could not stand being outside in the rain any longer, a man who had received his due share of the lashing rain. The man was staring down in the porch, and he stank of corruption. He was not the right sort of man, Holger felt. He was not a person you would invite into your house while your wife lay in labor. "May I come in?" the man said. "She's going to give birth soon," Holger said, "and she has a fever." "I'm sorry," the rain-lashed stranger replied, his head bowed. He hid his face under the brim of his hat and did not return Holger's look. "But there's nowhere I can seek shelter," he continued, "other than your house. Life has dragged me here. All I need is to get dried and maybe a plate of porridge. I've tried your neighbour's house, but they said they didn't take in strangers. Maybe I can cure her fever." Holger said her fever had to go down. Nothing was more important than that. And while he was closing the door to the porch, he said, "Unfortunately, you can't cure her fever." The man thumped on the door and yelled about corruption. "The time of corruption has come," he shouted, and the power of his emotion was unmistakable. The rain-lashed stranger was convinced. He knew everything about corruption. However, Holger Nielsen also knew a thing or two about corruption, to be sure, and he became furious, shouting at the man, telling him to leave them in peace, for she had a fever, and no one was to talk about corruption on his porch now that the baby was on its way. The next day the pains were more severe, and Elizabeth told Holger that the time had come. "Time to go to hospital," she said, meaning Bugdeo Cottage Hospital. Holger had not managed to overhaul the cart that autumn. There had been a great deal of hard work to do, with the barley and the haymaking, and there had just not been enough time. The cart was therefore more or less ready for a trip to the timber yard, but there was nothing wrong with the horse. There had never been anything wrong with the horse. They had been lucky regarding the horse. They set off for Cottage Hospital, she in the cart and he on the horse. They rolled along at an easy pace, the state of the cart not permitting speedy progress. They passed the farm belonging to Ragnhild, the woman with the demons and the meadows left to grow wild, but Holger made no mention of the decay of her place. He rode on in silence. The horses' hooves squelched in the ground and the wheels made deep tracks, causing them to lose speed. Elizabeth expressed her pain in song, in a lament that had been handed down from mother to daughter from time immemorial, and Holger thought she sang beautifully. At Pettersson's Junction they took the shortcut. He had taken part in the construction of the road. At that time he had been working for Hjalmar Pettersson, one of the rich local farmers. They had cleared rowans, laid a gravel surface and dug ditches, himself and Joachim Hansson, the half-German from Scheron. Hjalmar Pettersson had been in a hurry. The ditches were too shallow, and the road was often flooded. It was not used by many travellers, which troubled Holger, as he was proud of having built it. There was not a great deal in his life that made him feel proud. Pride resembled conceit, which resembled arrogance. But as soon as the subject of road construction was brought up, his neck stiffened, and his chest broadened like the breast of a rutting elk bull, as he described how they had toiled at the shortcut those years, himself and Hansson, the half-German from Scheron. The mud was thick. Holger spurred the horse and jerked the reins, and the horse toiled harder and did not bolt, in spite of the harsh handling. And the song she sang was the Vale of Tears, and her voice was as clear as melted snow, and the birds fell silent for a moment.
Rymmer du mig, famnar du mig, eller rammar du mig, eller stannar du kvar hos mig? Hämtar du mig till Jämmerdalen, eller glömmer du mig, eller glömmer du mig?
The horse snorted. His wet breath was steaming like smoke from a locomotive, settling like a cloud over him and the cart. Holger spurred the horse hard, too hard perhaps. Maybe he should have realized the horse's limitations, insofar as there were any to be mentioned. They got stuck in a hole. Holger jerked the reins harder, and a wheel fell off the axle. With a crash, the cart tipped over at the back, and a grouse was frightened to flight out of the thicket. The flapping of its wings echoed between the trees as it flew away through the forest. "The wheel axle," Holger muttered, scarcely surprised that it was the wheel axle that had given way first, even though it was ill-timed. Elizabeth burst into tears and asked why he had not checked the cart for faults. "Haven't had the time to give it an overhaul this autumn yet," Holger said, and his heart beat hard in his chest. "I just haven't had the time," he said. "It's the wheel axle. I didn't think we would have to drive to the cottage hospital. I thought the kitchen table would be good enough." While he was holding her in his arms, the sweat was running down his temples, and her tears were running over the lapels of his coat. She vomited up a greyish fluid, her eyes rolling around. She was shivering and humming softly like a purring cat. She clutched tightly a tuft of grass sunk in the mud, tore it loose and rubbed it over her chest, muddying her blouse. Holger realized that he would not be able to take her to the hospital. The road was a curse. Why had he taken the shortcut? Elizabeth pulled him towards her, and breathing heavily, said that there was someone walking through the forest. "What did you say?" Holger asked. Then she replied that there was nothing wrong with the horse. "You're delirious," Holger said. "No one ever uses a shortcut. It's a curse." She vomited up more grey fluid and gurgled. "Someone's coming out of the forest. Take the horse. Leave me and fetch help. I'll manage." The horse was standing at their feet, keeping watch over them, with his wet breathing. "You're so brave, Elizabeth, my dear," Holger said, stroking her cheek. "You're the bravest, but I won't leave you alone. The baby can come at any time at all now, and I don't dare. I'm afraid I can't." "We aren't alone," she said. "Can't you hear, Holger, in the forest?" Holger stood up and listened. He had been hard of hearing since an inflammation in his ears at the age of 3, but he did indeed hear footsteps coming from the forest. Holger shouted. No answer came. "It's probably Ragnhild," Holger said. "She never walks on roads, and she would never answer you." People reacted differently to Ragnhild, some admiring her eccentricities, others unwilling to have anything to do with her. It was reported that she had once brought a heifer back to life with her bare hands. "What use would she be to us?" Holger said. "We can't let her deliver the baby." "The doctor," Elizabeth said. "Ask her to fetch the doctor." "Yes, she can ride the horse to the village," Holger said. "I'll make her do it. She's not going to touch you. She shall go and fetch a doctor, and she shall ride on the roads, and she shall make off after the baby's born, for I've seen the way she looks at you." Now he caught a glimpse of a figure in the forest. The figure wore a slouch hat. "Ragnhild, is that you?" Holger shouted. "We're in need of help." Through the branches of the trees he could see the slouch hat coming towards them, at a slow and even pace through the brushwood. Holger shouted that his wheel axle had given way, but the figure did not look like Ragnhild. It looked like a man. "Maybe we're in luck," Holger said. "It's a man." Holger waved and shouted. "You should be careful with that word," Elizabeth said, and he asked her which word she meant. "Luck," she replied in a subdued voice. When the man came out onto the road, Holger fell silent. It was the same man who had been thumping on their door the previous evening. He still kept his face hidden under the brim of his hat, but his voice was steadier. He said something about the horse. "There's nothing wrong with the horse," Holger said. "You have to ride to the cottage hospital and fetch a doctor." "I can help you," the man said, raised his head and returned Holger's look. "But you must ride to the hospital." Holger shuddered when he saw the man's eyes. "Why can't you take the horse?" Holger asked. "I can't find my way hereabouts. I know nothing about this district," the man replied. "Who are you?" "I'm no one at all, but you can rely on me. I will help my neighbour, you can be sure about that. You didn't let me into your house yesterday. I'm terribly sorry. But it's not your fault. To err is human, and I forgive you." The man bowed his head and looked at Elizabeth. His eyes were like globes and had a strange gloss. Was the man blind? "She's vomiting grey bile," he said, and bowed his head towards the ground. "Vomiting grey bile is a bad sign. You must hurry. Go now. Ride off. You can find your way to the village. I'll wait here with her." He raised his head towards Holger and said, "I'll teach you how to treat a person in distress. You can rely on me. Go now. Ride off." Elizabeth nodded to Holger. She showed courage, and so too must he. Holger rode in the direction of the cottage hospital, his chest writhing in terror and anxiety, and with every breath he took, he wheezed. The closer he came to Bugdio, the more he was convinced that he had made a mistake. What was wrong with the man's eyes, and what had he done to deserve them? He stopped the horse several times to turn back, but each time he decided to continue riding towards the doctor. She showed courage, and so too must he. The doctor was having dinner with his wife and Holger rushed into the house. They were eating roast venison, and Holger excused himself for disturbing them at such an unchristian time of the day. He then described the mysterious stranger and his eyes, adding that he could not be blind, since he had seen the fluid which Elizabeth had vomited had been grey. Holger tried to keep to the facts, but his account was very incoherent. Suddenly the doctor rose quickly from the table and said, "Grey bile! Is she lying outdoors, chilled to her marrow, and vomiting grey bile? Then there's no time to lose. How could you leave her there?" Then Holger collapsed on the rug, fainting slightly. The doctor gave him water and he came to. "There's something peculiar about those eyes," Holger said. "But he's not blind. It's something worse." The doctor replied few things can be worse than lying in the autumn mud vomiting grey bile. Then they set off in urgent haste. Holger sat behind the doctor on the horse and tried to breathe more calmly. He was still wheezing and he drank water now and again. Eventually they turned off onto the shortcut. Holger noticed that the grass in the ditch was high and that the brushwood had begun to eat its way into the road. Now they saw the broken cart. The doctor said that there was no man there, that he had disappeared, and so he had. Only Elizabeth and the cart remained. She was lying in the middle of the road in front of the cart, her clothes covered with blood, holding the baby to her bosom. The horse squelched forward in the mud. Otherwise there was silence all round. "The baby is silent," the doctor said in a low voice. "It's not crying." Holger jumped swiftly off the horse, rushed to Elizabeth, picked up the baby, shook it. But it was lifeless and completely grey. He shook it again, blew into its mouth and removed the dirt from its little nose. But it was still lifeless and completely grey. Elizabeth was lying there, beyond all contact, with grass on her face. It was stillborn, the doctor said, giving his expert opinion. I'm terribly sorry. Holger said nothing. He vomited, and he wanted to yell out, but was incapable of making a sound. He lay down beside Elizabeth. The doctor held a piece of cloth under Elizabeth's nose, and she came to. That man, Holger whispered. That man. What has he done? Tell me, Elizabeth. What has he done to you? And where did he disappear to? She gave no reply. Then Holger shook her, and now he was yelling, but he could not hear himself. It was not until the doctor pulled him away and held his mouth shut that Holger realized that he had been yelling. He heard how the echo was bouncing across the forest. It was a daughter she had been carrying in her womb. The doctor clenched his fist and shook it at the heavens. Elizabeth rose and took the baby from Holger's arms. The doctor said they had to go to Cottage Hospital for treatment. However, Elizabeth said she refused to go to the hospital and started to walk home with her daughter in her arms. Home is where I'm heading, she said. Holger asked the doctor to come with them. Of course, the doctor said. I'll go home with you so that we can start the treatment there. The three of them walked home slowly in silence. Holger led the horse by the halter. His wheezing had ceased. They laid Elizabeth in the bedroom, and the doctor talked to Holger about the healing power of rest, emphasizing that she needed peace and quiet. The doctor departed for the cottage hospital in Bugdeo. In his thankfulness, Holger had let him borrow the horse for his journey home. He had protested at first, but Holger had insisted. You're a man who's greatly needed, Holger had said, and the doctor had ended up accepting the loan of the horse. It won't be for long, the doctor had said before riding off. The days passed, as did the nights. Holger buried his daughter by the tall spruce behind the woodshed and made her a cross of the best grade rowan wood. He then took care of their house, for a house that let in the cold lacked the power of healing, and he started with the wooden strips around the window frames and continued with the floorboards with the gaps between them, after which he weatherproofed the roof sheathing to keep the damp at bay during the winter storms. And all the time he made sure that she was allowed to rest in peace, just as the doctor had prescribed. And finally, when the house was completely weatherproof, Holger reflected that Hjalmar Pettersson should have been there now, for then he would have seen to be sure that Holger Nilsson could make a house weatherproof indeed, as long as he had enough time. And when he went into Elizabeth, he repeated that there was no longer any hurry, that they had time, and that time was the only thing they had now, so they would have to be careful with it. And he let her sleep in peace at night, and he gave her a good-night stroke on the cheek before closing the bedroom door and lying down on the kitchen couch. One night Holger is woken up by a thudding sound. He's torn out of his sleep with a start and discovers that the door is banging in the wind. He rushes into Elizabeth's room, which he finds empty, dashes out of the house, out into the night wearing only a shirt, and catches a glimpse of her back in the darkness. She is wearing her night dress, the white one with the design on the collar, the one that has been kept in the trousseau chest. She once told Holger that the collar was made of bobbin lace, and he has always thought that the design is beautiful. He sees how she is moving down the slope down towards the river, and if she were not wearing the white nightdress with the lace design, she would be difficult to detect in the night. But now she is shining, as it were, shining like she has always done, and she is walking with her back straight, with that splendid carriage which he once fell in love with. But that occasion has never felt as remote as it does now, although she is still shining nonetheless, for she is wearing her white nightdress. Holger is rushing after her. He can hear a melody, a bewitching tone with a sound that is strong and weak at the same time, and whose key is neither minor nor major, and he is dashing towards her. He does not manage to catch up with her, however. She is walking with firm steps down into the river, and the melody is becoming stronger as a nightdress is becoming soaked with water. It is the clear, melted snow from the mountains, and the flow is torrential, and her bearing is just as splendid as always. She is walking out into the deep, her nightdress rising to the surface, revealing a glimpse of her naked body beneath it. That nakedness which he loves most of all. But she is not prevented by the coldness of the water, and the river seizes hold of her, clutching her in its tight grip. Holger dives into the water and swims towards her, and they are drawn down into the deep by the current. The melody mixes with the roaring of the river and penetrates his marrow, and his ears are aching. It is a terrifying sound. He gets hold of her hair and presses her head up towards the surface of the water, but the power of the river is stronger and hurls them against its stony bed. Holger loses his grip of her and is flung around in the deep. The whole world is booming and whirling, and he cannot see her. And now he is aware of the icy coldness of the water, and that his fingers have become numb. Suddenly he feels her slipping away from him and tries to grab hold of her, but there is no longer any strength in his hands, and her fair hair is flowing with the current, and her naked skin is shimmering in the moonlight. Then there is a final shimmer before she is drawn down into the deep and disappears, while he is washed up onto the bank. When he woke up, he was lying with his face in the grass. The grass was rubbing roughly against his skin, as if it were going to strike root in his paws. It made him itchy, in his nose, behind his ears, through his clothes. The same grass that he used to mow late in the summer, dry on wooden racks and then turn into bales of hay in preparation for the winter. He would spend hours working with grass, but this was a new discovery, that grass could cause this itch. Holger could almost feel the grass grow. This had to be grass of a different kind, for no grass grew in the autumn month. He ran his hand over the blades. The tips of the blades were pointed. Cut grass had blunt ends, as if someone had been chewing the blades. This was not cut grass, but fresh grass. He tried to smell it. There was no smell coming from it, or had he lost his sense of smell? Could you lose your sense of smell? He smelled his fingers. He had not lost his sense of smell. It was the grass that lacked a scent. Holger knew what grass smelled like when it was growing, having absorbed that knowledge with his mother's milk, but he could not understand why this grass was free from scent. He understood its sharpness even less. Its blades were like a knife's edge. He hated knife edges. They aroused bad memories. He had lost a finger on his left hand due to a log floating accident. He had fallen into the water, and struggling against the current, his finger had been crushed between two logs. At first there had been hope that it would heal. Hjalmar Pettersson had given him sick leave to convalesce. The finger had changed colour many times, but when it turned black, Holger had understood that there was no use procrastinating. He had cut it off with a butcher's knife. Later on, the doctor said that he had done the right thing, that he had prevented gangrene from spreading. Gangrene, Elizabeth had said with worry in her eyes. Imagine that, Holger. You were lucky to have sacrificed that finger. Lucky, he had replied, for he had not considered that to be the right word. Then she nodded and smiled, and it had been then that he had understood that she was the courageous type. He would do it once again, would sacrifice a finger just to hear her say that he was lucky once again. She had slipped away from him so slowly, and still he had not been able to reach her. From the slope up from the bank, he had seen how the nightdress had drifted downstream together with his wife. And he could not forget the glossy, globular eyes, and he could envisage how they had shone while the baby was being born. And even if it could never bring Elizabeth or the baby back, he wanted to carve the glossiness out of those eyes. It was not until he had risen and turned towards the house that he realized that he had been evicted. The odourless grass had conquered it. The facade was covered with verdure, not only grass, but also with trees and peat moss. The forest had taken his house from him. The windows had been smashed and the top of a tree stuck out of the chimney. To all appearances, the top of a moorland pine. The moorland pine grew in the dry soil that was only to be found on moors, and at first Holger thought that he had made the house too waterproof, so that the pine had been attracted by the absence of moisture. But then he checked himself. House could never be waterproof enough, and a moorland pine could never strike root indoors, even if the house were dry as dust and waterproof as a duck's back. There had to be some other explanation, but that was a riddle that remained to be solved. He looked around. He saw the forest, but it was quite clearly a forest of a different kind. Lichen hung from trees and tied up their networks of branches to form impenetrable lumps. The trunks were covered with mosses that resembled algae, as if the trees had been lying in the sea for years and years. Holger saw the vegetation that was submerging the old forest beneath it in its ravaging process. He heard a crack when the tall spruce in front of the woodshed burst open, and moss gushed out like bowels from the pierced stomach of a pig, gushed out and devoured the tall spruce from within, smothering it. It was the violent noise of a catastrophe that exploded from the inside and outwards. The new forest was filled with clouds of pollen dust, and pistils were whirling all around him. The forest dust was dry and irritated his throat. It made him thirsty, but the well was overgrown with vegetation. He descended the slope towards the river, but could not reach the water's edge, for there was no water left. The river was overgrown with vegetation, and he smelled the dried-up riverbed. Odourless. Then it struck him that if the river had dried up, then perhaps she managed to survive. that she was lying a short distance downstream in her nightdress, that she might be lying there, alive. He ran down along the river, which was overgrown with brushwood. It was like running in a primeval forest, and the forest dust was making him thirstier. He imagined how he would find her at the water's edge, how she would waken up and adjust her nightdress and tell him she was lucky he had come, how he would reply that this was not lucky, that lucky was not the right word, that it was a miracle, and she would say that miracles did not happen to people like them, that they would just have to content themselves with luck, and how he would insist and lift her up and hold her against the sky, and maybe he would catch a glimpse of the sun while telling her, "This is indeed a miracle, my dearest, and miracles do indeed happen to people like us. Just look around you and see how the forest has saved you from the water." And he envisaged the eyes that took her, and he envisaged gouging them out with his dagger, and the fluid running down the man's cheek. He ran along the riverbed, but could not recognize the place. The odorless forest had deformed the countryside, which had been his home district all his life. After a while he reached a house, but he recognized it easily. It was his own house, with the moorland pine in the chimney. Holger turned back and rushed in the other direction, away from the house. The reeds were difficult to penetrate, being as high as the reeds along the coast at the seashore, but he made his way through them, and with the forest dust filling his lungs, he wheezed, slowed down and coughed. Eventually he caught a glimpse of a house beyond the reeds, and when he moved aside the last cluster of reeds blocking his view, he found himself standing in front of his own house once again. Holger then chose the track leading to Justerosen, the rocky knoll, providing a view of the whole Okala parish. It was a well-worn track he was following, and the forest dust decreased somewhat. He ran towards the hilltop and forced his way through last year's brushwood, which was meant to grow until it became thick enough to use as firewood. But he was astonished when he saw what was situated beyond the alder trees. The house, with the same moorland pine protruding from the chimney. Exhausted, he stepped inside, and not worrying about the verger in the house, lay down on the bed, looked up at the ceiling panels and recovered his breath. There was no forest dust in the house. Maybe this was because the house was so weatherproof now, Holger reflected, but the window was broken, so there had to be some other explanation. He lay for hours like that, staring at the ceiling panels. He noticed that the ceiling had to be repainted, for the paint had flaked off here and there, and when his gaze moved from the ceiling panels, the dusk had set in, and the sun was shining red above the treetops. Holger went out onto the porch, remembered that he had stood there the first time he had met the stranger with the slouch hat, and he shuddered at the thought of the words spoken by the man that evening when the rain lashed the countryside. The evening was coming to a tranquil end, and he followed the sun's gliding descent above the vast expanses of the countryside, and he wept, for he should not be experiencing such beauty, and he should not be experiencing such loneliness. When the sun dipped behind the treetops over Ragnhild's meadows, a light flared up. Holger wondered if she had set the place on fire. Ragnhild often talked about setting the place on fire, said that no one would stop her anyway, if she ever got round to it someday. Holger rose and walked towards the shining light, wiped the tears from his eyes and focused his gaze. He walked slowly towards the light and thought that she finally had got round to it, and that she had been right in foreseeing that no one would stop her. When he came closer to the fire, he heard the thumping of a drum. The repeated thumps exerted a bewitching enticement, but he did not want to show his face, since Ragnhild would then have been wrong, and would not be able to say that no one had been there when she had set fire to the place. Ragnhild was definitely not the kind of person you wanted to prove wrong. Holger crept towards the magic drums at the fire, looked around to avoid being caught, and crouched forward as he came closer to the fire. He crawled over the last short stretch through odorless moss. At Ragnhild's meadow he hid behind a small spruce. In the middle of the glade, green logs and odorless saplings were burning, and around the fire, bodies were swarming in clouds of forest dust and smoke. But nowhere could Holger see Ragnhild standing with her grey shawl wrapped around her head, lamenting. Creatures were swarming around the fire, but these swarming creatures were neither animals nor people, but creatures of a bizarre kind. They were human limbs alternating with animal limbs, oxen without any fur on their backs and yelping rodents as big as yearling hares. The martens were no bigger than the toads. The bears walked upright and appeared to have human bodies. Hooves pawed the ground, sending odorless forest dust flying into the fire to burn, creating a crackling firework display for the small creatures. In their dance, the creatures went upright, keeping their paws and hooves on each other's back. Even the badger danced on its hind legs, and Ragnhild was nowhere to be found. She would never leave her land voluntarily, Holger reflected. They must have captured her. The thumping of the drum increased in speed, the whirling of the dance exhilarated. Faster and faster around the fire danced a spinning community of malformed fauna. The smoke whirled, and Holger was swayed into the rhythm of the dance of the fire. He was not coughing from the forest dust, and thought that nature's essence is changeable, distorted, unifying. He felt hazier and hazier, and then he caught sight of something familiar in the fire. The eyes. They were staring straight at him, and now Holger saw that they were immobile. The eyes were fixed in their sockets and were quite drowsy, and time was brought to a standstill, like the wheel of a cart stuck in the mud. Anger clawed at his chest, and he wanted to draw his dagger and rush forward, but his throat clogged up, shutting out the air. And even if anger can achieve a great deal in life, it cannot prise open clogged-up windpipes. And he was expecting dizziness and chest pain, but that did not happen. And he was expecting panic, but that did not happen either. And he thought perhaps that he had not been detected after all, and should therefore remain behind the small spruce. His breath came back to him. The man of corruption ran his hand across the fire, closed his eyes and started to quake. From his shoulder blades emerged the wings of a great grey owl. From his fingers sprouted the black claws of a white-tailed eagle, and from his skin grew hair as thick as a brown bear's. Holger had heard many stories about the Siren of the Woods and the evil water sprite, but this was completely different, and nobody had ever mentioned this creature. When they had acquired their house, which now belonged to him alone, they had been informed about the sprite of the farm, who took good care of the farm animals. She was most welcome to remain at their farm, as they would never be able to afford a farmhand or a farm maid. Their house was well drained. Holger thought that the drainage of a house was important, and that was why they had said yes to the proposition. The farm sprite just came attached as a bonus. But why had no one said anything about this man with the glossy eyes when they had set up home in the district? The man, who now resembled a great horned owl with the body of a bear, unfolded his heavy wings and screeched. The screech cut its way across the meadowland. The drums ceased. So too did the dance. The beast turned towards Holger. The forest dust settled on the ground. Silence fell. Holger stood still like the hare stands when a beast of prey is approaching, petrified without blinking an eye, in the diffident hope that he is not being seen. Slowly the man lowered his wings. The fire crackled. A burning green log fell into the bed of embers, sending up a cloud of ashes into the sky. Then Holger turned around with a start and rushed away. As he ran, Holger heard a rumbling approaching him from behind. He turned around to see what it was. The bear people! Their paws were making a muffled patter on the ground. Holger was darting forth so quickly that his chest was aching. His lead was diminishing. He ran out onto the track, but they gained ground even more. He ran into a stretch of brushwood and zigzagged between the densely growing thin trunks of aspens. The bear people hurled themselves straight through the aspens, indiscriminately, mowing down everything that stood in their way, like logs set in motion when a log jam blocking the river has been blasted by the floaters. The bear people lunged at him with their paws, one of them tearing the back of his shirt, the blue one with the bronze buttons. One of them flew at his head, and he flung himself to the ground, knocking his knees against a log as he landed. The bear man bit him on the foot, locking his jaws onto him, and it seemed futile to put up a struggle. Then Holger recalled Pettersson's endless chuckling. The old man used to sit in his rocking chair and go on about how futility and despondency were the curse only of the weak, and how everyone who steeled themselves escaped their clutch. For once in Holger's life, the memory of Pettersson infused him with strength. Holger was not going to let himself be sacrificed to futility. The last thing he wanted was to lie on his deathbed and be convinced that all his life had been futile, that nothing made any difference in the fatuity of transience. Holger gave the bear man a rap on the nose and managed to slip out of his boot and escape. He ran away on the forest track with only one boot, his knees aching badly, wheezing terribly, and now he had a small head start once again. He managed to reach his house, hurled himself into the hall with a crash and locked the door, just before the bear people crashed into it with a bang. They pulled frenetically at the door handle and knocked on the door panels. He huddled up on the hall floor, expecting the door to give way and the bear people to storm in. He yelled that he would never give in, and let slip that the sprite of the farm would torment them with a vengeance. He did not know what had inspired him to say that, but the beast fell silent at once, and then retreated. He waited for nightfall. While he was pacing to and fro about the house, he tried to work out how everything had gone wrong. He swept up some pine needles from the floor and put them into the sink. He looked at the moorland pine sticking up through the chimney, and suddenly felt a confidence inspired by nature. Holger was convinced of nature's good intentions, and as he looked around his home, he realized that the moorland pine and the other plants had barricaded the house to protect him. Here there was no forest dust, and here he was safe. He decided that he would never again leave his house. He lay down on the kitchen couch, and his thoughts centered on his mother. When he was a child, she used to stroke his forehead when he was about to fall asleep. She always stroked him with the back of her hand, which was rough and rather knobbly. It was a serene recollection. He was no longer afraid. "Mother is beside me," he said out loud, and tried to hear what it sounded like. It sounded good. At dawn, Holger heard a scratching on the door. First there were 2 cautious scraping sounds made by blunt claws, followed by 2 quick thuds of a more distinct nature, then a short pause before this rhythm was repeated. Scratch, scratch, thud, thud. Scratch, scratch, thud, thud. The sounds were light, and could not have been made by the bear people. Holger tried to peep under the door, but could not see a thing. The bottom seal preventing drafts blocked his view. He had done a good job attaching it, and no one could complain about his craftsmanship, but it was a pity he could not see who was making those strange signals. However, it did not make any difference anyway. He had decided that he would never again leave the house. Scratch, scratch, thud, thud. Holger wondered when their dreadful misfortune had actually begun. Had it not started when they left the house? That indeed had been the beginning of it all. They should never have left their farm. The decision taken during the night still held. There was a great deal that needed fixing. Windows needed to be repaired, the walls had to be cleared of moss, and the flaking ceiling panels in the bedroom had to be repainted. Moreover, there were plenty of pine needles in the house. Holger knew how to survive for a long time by drinking pine needle soup. Scratch, scratch, thud, thud. Scratch, scratch, thud, thud. On the other hand, Holger had been punished by the stranger with the slouch hat for not giving him shelter from the lashing rain. Perhaps he had deserved punishment for this deed. One should open one's house to a stranger if it rained. Holger could admit that such an act of hospitality was demanded by decency and good manners, although he deemed the punishment inflicted on him to be excessively harsh, indeed ruthless, to say the least. The animal's persistent knocking sent a clear signal, and he had no other choice than to learn from his mistakes. When someone was knocking on your door, you should let them in. Holger unlocked the door. He straightened his back, wanting to confront the unknown with self-respect, and with a look that showed he was a kind of man who opened his house to strangers when they came knocking. He was that kind of man, to be sure, and no one was going to be left in doubt. Outside it was cold and cloudy. There was a thin layer of clouds which would probably disperse later on in the day. In the farmyard a grey hare was standing, somewhat larger than the first leverets born in the spring. His eyes were dark and deep. There was a white spot on the fur of his neck. Holger noticed that one of his front teeth was white, while the other was red. The hare beckoned to him. "I'll show him the metal I'm made of," Holger said to himself, and followed him. The hare led him to a dense grove by the tall spruce behind the woodshed, where he had buried his baby. Among the trees a wild fowl was standing, a capercaillie. A little brass bell dangled from one of his claws. Holger, who had heard many reports of the fierce temper of the capercaillie, backed slowly towards the tall spruce. Then the capercaillie spoke in a domineering tone. He started with gurgling chirps, and then switched to a gulping sound reminiscent of a bottle being uncorked. The capercaillie's throat was vibrating, and suddenly Holger could make out words. "Holger, sir?" Holger froze. Had he been hearing right? Holger, sir? He looked around. Was the bird really able to speak? He looked at the hare, who stood among the brushwood a few meters away, nibbling at a branch with his red and white teeth. Holger, sir. He felt ill at ease. He stooped down. You're speaking to me. Or is it just me speaking to you? Can you really speak? I must have been hearing wrong. Holger, pay attention. What? You are speaking to me? What do you want from me? Holger whispered gently so as not to frighten the bird. Holger, pay attention. How do you know my name? Of course I know you by name, Holger. You belong to an unenlightened species, sir. You need answers, and I am in possession of what you are seeking. Holger did not understand a thing. An unenlightened species? Who are you? He asked. I am the Capercaillie King. Well, you're a Capercaillie, I can see that all right. I am not just an ordinary Capercaillie. Look upon me rather as a Capercaillie King. As a king? Yes, quite right. A king. Holger was fingering the lingonberry sprigs abstractedly. He was perplexed. The Capercaillie was not exactly regarded as the king of the forest. We usually say it's the elk who's the king of the forest, he said. The Capercaillie came closer to Holger, inflating his throat and murmuring. The elk? The elk is sluggish and tardy, moves in an ungraceful and clumsy manner, and in all respects is exceedingly wary. Tell me, pray, what kingly qualities the elk might possess? His antlers, Holger replied, backing a few more paces, and his grandeur. The Capercaillie is the king of the forest. Holger regretted leaving the house. This was a bad omen. Capercaillie were dangerous animals. He was about to lose his patience and did not want to provoke the Capercaillie any more, this peculiar creature. You will have to excuse me, Holger said apologetically. But the Capercaillie is quite simply not regarded as the king of the forest. It's the elk who's the king of the forest. The elk? That long-legged, deplorable, dilatory cadger? You are indeed a member of an unenlightened species, sir. In truth, unenlightened. If you call the elk the king of the forest, what, pray, do you call the Capercaillie? We are wont to call the Capercaillie the horse of the forest. The horse of the forest? Aye. The Capercaillie hurled himself at Holger, beat his wings, inflated his throat. Please, calm down, will you? Holger said, warding the Capercaillie off with his boot. The bird calmed down somewhat. Holger became more and more alarmed. You belong, in truth, to a peculiar species, but that is no news to me. Allow me to ask you, sir, what do you call the horse? Horses are beasts of burden, and we call them by their names. By their names?
How can that possibly work? Horses are simple-minded herd animals, lacking personality. Do they answer to names?
Horses are robust animals, Holger asserted. They are capable of doing hard work, that I can vouch for. We would have been unable to manage without them. That's probably why there aren't any horses left in the forest any longer. Holger tasted the lingonberries, which were ripe this time of year, soft and bright red, juicy. The capercaillie was humming softly.
Capable of hard work, indeed. They are simple-minded herd animals that offer blind obedience. That's what they are. But, sir, how come the capercaillie is called the horse of the forest? We are definitely no docile labourers.
Good question, Holger replied, and swallowed the lingonberries. Maybe it's because there aren't any horses left in the forest any longer. Now it's the capercaillie who has taken his place as the most robust animal in the forest. Isn't that so?
Yes, to be sure. But we are no docile slaves.
The capercaillie took a few paces closer to Holger, opening his small eyes wide and repeating,
"We are not docile slaves."
Holger paced around among the lingonberry bushes, which bore an abundance of berries, and he picked a whole handful. The capercaillie strutted about, his head held high, his humming turning into creaking. Holger pondered a while before he once again concluded that this had to be the reason why the capercaillie was called the horse of the forest.
You humans are a most peculiar species indeed. That has been our opinion for a long time, sir. However, you are not to regard me as a horse, but look upon me as a king, a capercaillie king, for that is what I am, and as such I wish to be received.
Holger felt a burning sensation in his stomach. Eating too many raw lingonberries is not good for you. He squatted down. You will have to excuse me, he said, but how does one conduct oneself in relation to a capercaillie king?
The bearing that you have assumed now is an excellent posture, sir. Your bearing is respectful. A capercaillie king is preferably to be looked upon with respect.
This was nonsense. Pure stupidity to stand there talking drivel like that. Holger rose to return to his house, get things done, put things right after the invasion by the forest, clear the moss from the walls before it caused damp to spread. He scratched his head. I'm sorry, he declared, but this is simply nonsense. I have to go home and put my house in order. The elk is the king of the forest, as he has always been, and the capercaillie has been the horse of the forest for ages. There's nothing I can do about that.
Stay. For your own enlightenment.
No, I'm sorry, I have to put my house in order.
Holger, stay.
Unfortunately,
For your own sake and for the sake of your child.
Holger became petrified. Had he heard right?
Yes. Stay for the sake of your daughter.
What do you mean by that? Holger grabbed hold of the capercaillie. Tell me, what do you know about my child?
Do not touch me.
Holger released his grip.
To begin with, sir, I want you to regard me as the capercaillie king that I in actual fact am. That is to say, if you want to know what happened to your daughter...
Yes, to be sure. You are the capercaillie king, Holger said, bowing. The capercaillie is the king of the forest, quite right, of course. And perhaps the elk is a horse of the forest.
Yes, why not? Elks are both simple-minded and docile animals, and none of them know the art of ruling.
Does that satisfy you? The elk is the horse of the forest.
Splendid.
The capercaillie king started to tell the story of the eternal kingdom, while Holger settled himself among the lingonberry bushes and ate more berries. Beneath the sourness of the fresh lingonberries, there is an undertone of sweetness that makes it difficult to stop eating them once you've started, even if they can cause stomachache. The eternal kingdom had once been a place of complete harmony. Then everyone had obeyed the brass bell of the capercaillie king, even the wolverines and the martens. For some time now, however, a war had been dividing the kingdom into two. Holger interrupted the capercaillie. He could not understand what connection there was between all this and his daughter. He told the capercaillie what had happened along the shortcut and in the river, about the man with the glossy eyes, and how he had been transformed at the fire, and how he himself had been chased by the bear people. The capercaillie king then explained that the man with the glossy eyes was called Yugin. His real name was something else, but nobody knew what it was. Nor did anyone know where he came from. He was the one who had started the war. It had been so easy for him to win the confidence of the carnivores, merely by questioning the power of the brass bell. Since then, all the predators had been his subjects, and only the herbivores had remained loyal to the capercaillie king.
It is true that the herbivores are pure animals, and I have nothing against them. But tell me, where can one find a bull elk strong enough to slay a wolverine? Can you answer that question?
No, Holger replied. Such elks do not exist. Nevertheless, the herbivores had outnumbered the carnivores, gained an advantage, and come close to winning the war. Then an incredible development had taken place. Yugin had learned how to cross the borders between the different worlds, spending one day in the Eternal Kingdom and the other in Holger's world. Since then, his army had been superior. What Holger had seen at the fire had been Yugin's metamorphosis. The capercaillie king murmured and gurgled and spoke for a long time about Yugin's boundless evil, and about how they had lost one battle after the other, and he described in detail how beautiful the kingdom had been before the war. Holger was a simple man who appreciated the small pleasures of life, such as successfully roofing his cowshed, or eating white fish grilled over an open fire in the heat of an early summer's evening. Being a simple man, he disliked anyone toying with him like a cat toys with a mouse. He sharpened his tone and asked the Capercaillie king to come to the point. His daughter. It was Eugen who had captured his daughter. He had hoped that he might have been wrong. That would have been easier. Then there would not have been any vengeance, only futility. But now a craving for vengeance grew strong in his heart, with claws that scratched and tore at the inside of his chest, and with a determination to burst out through his ribs. The Capercaillie king told Holger how Eugen crossed over between the two worlds to steal the souls of unborn babies. He then used these souls to create his bear people, who were called humans. These were mighty creatures who had turned the course of the war to Eugen's advantage. Holger slowly chewed some lingonberries and then swallowed them. So, his daughter had been turned into a bear woman, or cuman as they were called. A cuman. She was one of the beasts who had chased him to the house. It was difficult to believe that she had been misshapen into such a monster, but Holger realized at the same time that he had no other choice, as the simple man he was, than to embrace his fate. Holger asked if there was anything he could do.
"Give me that branch."
Holger reached the Capercaillie king a pine branch that had fallen onto the ground, whereupon the Capercaillie started to hack the bark off it. He explained that peeled pine branches like this one constituted part of their weaponry. After the power of the bell had been weakened, the Capercaillie king had sought other sources of strength for a long time. Someone had told him how their forefathers had used pine branches peeled of their bark during the wars they had waged, namely the wars before the Brass Age. Returning to the use of wood had proven to be a successful tactic. "You mean to say you actually fight with pine branches?" Holger asked.
"We fight with purity. Pine wood is the purest kind of wood, as you probably already know. Behold how shiny it becomes."
The Capercaillie king held out a peeled branch. Holger nodded. The pine branch had indisputably become shiny. He cut a branch off the nearest pine and started to tear off the bark. The sap emitted a sweet scent, and he realized that he had never really appreciated the purity concealed by the pine beneath its bark. Although Holger was a man who appreciated the small pleasures of life, he could never have believed that those would include such a simple thing as the purity of the peeled pine branches. The peeling was meditative. The sweet scent of the sap gave him great satisfaction, and he rubbed the smooth branch against the wings of his nose as he smelled it.
They could not defend themselves against purity. The carnivores are impure animals, and that was why the purity of the pine branches had such a severe impact on them, you see,"
the Capercaillie explained. "How can I help you?" Holger asked, holding a branch like a spear, taking aim and testing its pliancy.
"You can continue cutting and peeling pine branches. Tonight, The battle will take place.
As soon as tonight? But is there really any use throwing pine branches at the humans?
Throwing branches? You humans are an amusing species. We are naturally going to make stone sledgehammers with the branches.
Sledgehammers? I thought the purity of pinewood would be quite sufficient.
Oh, you are indeed an unenlightened species. Did you think that we waged battle by throwing branches?
I have no idea how you wage battle, Holger said, peeling the last piece of bark off the pine branch. This is not my war.
Yes, this war is also your war. Your view of reality is indeed one-dimensional. I suppose that you find the eternal kingdom difficult to grasp, and that, like other humans, you live under the delusion that there is no existence beyond the reach of your eyes. This war has been your war for a long time, which is a fact you have just not been aware of.
Anyone who has ever harboured the craving for vengeance in his breast is acquainted with the frustration of having to live with it, and find consolation solely in the hope of one day succeeding in smothering it. The feeling will never let itself be smothered, however, and in the end, it is only the person craving vengeance who is smothered. This was a fate that Holger was to be spared, for the Capercaillie king had planned a battle where Holger's craving for vengeance was the most powerful weapon in his army. The hare with the red and white front teeth was a most skillful spy. He had informed the Capercaillie king that Eugen was travelling about carelessly with only a small troop of humans. As a rule, hares were faithless animals, and therefore the Capercaillie king had not had any problems in recruiting his spy. Nevertheless, a long time had lapsed before the king had dared to rely on the hare completely. His confidence in his spy had now grown strong, however, thanks largely to his information about the small troop of humans accompanying Eugen. It was a well-known fact that it was the information provided, and not his pedigree, that made the spy. And this piece of information was invaluable, even though it came from a hare, this generally faithless creature. As warriors, the humans were loyal, but not particularly quick-witted, and could be conquered if they were taken by surprise. There was now some hope in defeating Eugen, and restoring the previous order. Great trust was placed in Holger's contempt for death. With contempt for death in its ranks, an army could win improbable victories. This is what the Capercaillie king talked about at the same time as he wound the pine branches around a stone. Each sledgehammer required 8 peeled pine branches. He wove them tightly together. Holger lit a fire. The Capercaillie king then held a sledgehammer over the fire. The sap from the newly peeled pine branches bubbled in the flames, running like glue and sticking the branches to each other around the stone. The ends of some of the branches stuck out from the sooty stone ball. "That would remind you of a mace," Holger said, when the Capercaillie king handed him the black sledgehammer.
On the ground, it is merely a part of the natural eco-cycle, but in one's hand it becomes a weapon. Pray, sir, feel its weight.
The sledgehammer made Holger's hand sooty. The weapon plunged his mind into darkness. This was the first time he held a weapon intended to kill. Holger let the weight of the sledgehammer pull him as he swung it back and forth in the air and over the fire. Retribution was drawing nearer, and he took delight in this, for he had learned how to appreciate the small pleasures of life, such as revenge for an injustice, and he smiled at the thought of the sledgehammer crushing those eyes, and then coming down again and again until Eugen became part of the natural eco-cycle once again. There was a scratching, itching sensation under his ribs, and Holger yelled until his voice cracked. The Capercaillie king rang his brass bell, but Holger did not stop yelling.
Excellent. Then let us depart. The time has come.
They marched off, with the hare spy slightly ahead, and Holger and the Capercaillie king just after him. The final battle, as the Capercaillie king called it, was approaching. The clouds were about to break up, but the sky was still grey. There was a light breeze blowing through the treetops, and the autumn leaves were falling slowly to the ground. They were to meet up with the other herbivores below Oosterhausen. With his craving for vengeance filling his chest and sledgehammers on his back, Holger was prepared to confront his adversary. They were marching along the road past Ragnhild's farm, when Holger suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned round. The doctor from Bugdeo Cottage Hospital was standing there, with Holger's horse in a halter. The horse exhaled the warm, wet breaths which Holger was so familiar. "Holger," the doctor said, and as usual, Holger felt paltry when he heard the authority in the doctor's voice. "I have come to give your horse back to you, not because there's anything wrong with it. I just thought you would probably—" "Oh, my dear friend, what's the matter with you?" "I'm fine. There's never been anything wrong with the horse," Holger said, and handed the doctor a sooty sledgehammer of stone. "Here!" A short distance along the road, the Capercaillie king and the hare were standing. The doctor seemed to have his misgivings. "Feel the weight," Holger urged. "On the ground it's merely part of the natural eco-cycle, but in your hand it becomes a weapon. It is you who are the weapon, not the sledgehammer. Let the suit blacken your hands." "Holger," the doctor said, dropping the sledgehammer onto the ground. "What's wrong with you? Come with me. We can go to Bugdeo together. Let's take the horse." "No, I'm sorry," Holger said, picking up the sledgehammer. "The final battle." The doctor seized hold of his arm and riveted his gaze upon him. He asked him what he meant by the final battle, and he spoke with a voice that had never been more authoritative. He asked him once again, stressing that he would not content himself with evasive answers. The doctor demanded straight answers. However, Holger said no more. The battle would soon be raging, but that was something the doctor would never comprehend. It was impossible to convince him of any other truths than the ones which he already believed in, like the doctor he was. Holger turned the doctor away and walked towards the Capercaillie king and the hare. "This can lead to compulsory care, Holger," the doctor declared, "and then it'll be Bugdeo Cottage Hospital in any case, whether you like it or not. Do you want to force us to commit you for compulsory treatment, Holger?" Holger pondered over the doctor's compulsory care, and he realized that the compulsion which the doctor was referring to was just a question of empty words. The doctor might be a learned man, but he knew little about compulsion. What Holger was now compelled to do, the doctor would never be able to comprehend. While they were marching up towards Oosterhausen, the hare explained how important it was that Holger should fight on the front line, since he harboured such a need for vengeance. Holger could feel nothing but pride at being able to fight in the vanguard, for this battle was his battle. Futility was a feeling he had abandoned forever. When they reached the top of Justerosen, they saw how the peace-loving animals crept out of the nooks and crannies of the forest and crowded together at the foot of the slope. There were elks, deer, hares, and wood mice. Above them a few crossbills, and the occasional waxwing were gliding. A willow warbler sang its gentle call. Huit, huit, and hopped restlessly between the birch trees. Another willow warbler responded with its melancholy song. Huit, huit. A few more willow warblers gathered in the branches. They responded to each other's song, and some of them sang in unison. When I was a child, Holger said to the Capercaillie king, I had great difficulty in telling the difference between the songs of the willow warbler and the chaffinch.
Never in my life have I had any problem in distinguishing one bird from another. I consider that to be a human concern. I find all that extremely simple.
Of course, Holger said. You can hear the difference in the end notes.
Difference? The difference between you and us is your hopeless striving for knowledge. We possess inborn knowledge, and our knowledge is thus pure and complete. Your knowledge, sir, will therefore never be a knowledge characterized by purity.
The willow warbler's song rises at the end, while the chaffinch's falls, Holger asserted. The Capercaillie king, however, made no further comment on the two passerines. The sky was no longer overcast. The clouds had dispersed, and the sun was shining a deep orange, as it was wont to do on certain days in the autumn. The sun hung low in the sky. Soon the frosty nights would commence. Holger gazed up at the sky, finding nothing strange about it, merely marvelling at its immense beauty this time of year. The birches swung to and fro more and more vehemently in the wind, swiveled around and around, finally loosened their roots from the ground, and then started to move forward. The birches accompanied the flocks and herds of animals, moving slowly forward at the sluggish pace of an elk, and their branches were filled by more and more willow warblers singing their melancholy song. Flocks of willow warblers, all of whom now sang in unison. Holger could not believe his eyes. Never in his life had he seen birch trees walking.
That scarcely surprises me, for there are not many humans who have. Note that they are called betulas.
Betulas? That sounds like a Latin name, Holger said. The Capercaillie king did not reply. Holger decided to stop asking questions. He did not want to be reminded of his human ignorance, which he was all too familiar with by now. The birch trees continued to march forward. He could not understand how they managed, but then there was no need for him to know either. The peace-loving animals who obeyed the Capercaillie king moved towards Eugen's haunt at Ragnhild's meadows. The betulas marched at the very front with all the willow warblers of the forest in their crowns, chirping and hopping between the branches. Behind them marched the elks, and behind them came the rest. They plunged down the hillside, brandishing their sledgehammers of stone, as if they were enraged carnivores in the first days of the war, and Holger ran in the front line as he had been ordered to. But suddenly he was overtaken by the hare, and he could not understand why. But he probably just could not comprehend to the full the noble art of war, although he did feel slightly duped, and tried his best to catch up with the hare, But it was impossible, because the hare was so swift. The eyes. Once again, Holger was standing in front of the eyes. His sledgehammer was swinging in his hand. The gravity of the moment was causing his throat to thicken, as was the forest dust. He swallowed slowly. The hare was standing in front of Eugen, pointing at Holger with his paw. Eugen tenderly patted the hare on the head with the tip of his wing, as if to show his thankfulness. The hare stepped up onto Eugen's bare feet, as Eugen fondly stroked him behind his ears. From the hare's head, horns now emerged, and his right paw was transformed into a hoof. The horns were thick and as knobbly as the antlers of an elk, and they grew larger and larger as Eugen stroked them, and the hare was making a cooing sound, expressing his deep satisfaction. Three elk stepped out into the meadow with sledgehammers hanging from their antlers. They tried to hurl the sledgehammers at Eugen, but failed. The sledgehammers became entangled in their antlers and dangled like enormous earrings when they tried to throw them. A couple of cumans attacked them head-on, stabbed at their neck and slew them. Holger heard the Capercaillie king mutter something like, "ungracious" and "clumsy," and pitied the elks as they came crashing down onto the ground. So huge, but oh so useless creatures, he reflected. Not worth more than the meat they provide. Supplying meat for carnivores, that's all they're fit for, poor animals. The cumans were now attacked from behind by the betulas, whose crowns were filled with the willow warblers singing their battle songs in unison. The cumans backed away from the birch trees. The singing of the willow warblers grew louder and louder. The Capercaillie king chuckled proudly and tinkled his brass bell. The betulas shuffled closer to Eugen and the hare, who now looked more like a hare elk, and they dropped their stone sledgehammers on top of Eugen. Blood started to pour out of Eugen's head. He hissed and tried to duck, but the betulas reached him from all directions with their black sledgehammers, thanks to the height. Eugen hooted as more and more sledgehammers fell on top of him. From deep inside the forest, a clattering sound could be heard, coming from the valley on the other side of Justeråsen. The blood from Eugen's forehead ran down into his globular eyes in an almost transparent flow. He tried to remove the blood with the tip of his wing, but it was thick and formed an even worse sticky mess. Then a betula dropped a sledgehammer that hit him right above one of his eyes. The eye burst with a hollow sound. A sooty stream of blood ran out of his eye, but Eugen did not stop hooting. The clattering sound in the valley ceased. The Capercaillie king bounced over to Eugen, who now lay on the ground, and he placed his brass bell on top of the stone sledgehammer resting on the eye that had burst. The Capercaillie chuckled and stretched out his neck. One could now hear wings flapping in the forest. It sounded like a huge flock of birds flying with short, rapid beats. Eugen reacted with a start, sending the brass bell falling to the ground. A flock of black birds now stormed out of the forest. They were black woodpeckers, and hordes of them were streaming out of the forest. For a short while, the whole world consisted of these red-headed creatures. Their red heads filled the birch trees, and the willow warblers scattered in flight in all directions. The black woodpeckers picked at the birches, their drilling sounding like an entire regimental band, and they hammered out large holes in the tree trunks. The betulas struck root in the middle of the meadow.
"Do not strike root! Do not strike root!"
the Capercaillie king commanded, hacking at the roots, but his efforts were futile. The roots were already firmly fixed in the ground. Hugin hooted, and now more humans were crawling to his aid. There was a swarm of them closing a ring around the Capercaillie king and attacking him. The Capercaillie king yelled and hacked at their fur to escape, but the humans had no difficulty in holding down the body of the little wild fowl. Holger now hurled himself at Hugin, swinging his sledgehammer and letting it fall down upon Hugin's neck. The thudding blow sent Hugin's neat shoulder feathers whirling into the air, and Holger's eyes narrowed in a smile. He swung his weapon of black purity again, feeling a tremendous pleasure as the next blow hit Hugin's side, right under the wing. With a downward beat, Hugin now closed his heavy wing over Holger's arm, whipping up forest dust from the grass. Holger coughed, but that he could bear. The craving for vengeance seethed in his veins, bringing a longed-for intoxication. At this moment, his vengeance was a newly built boat, about to be launched at last into its element, into the turbulence of the spring flood. The hare-elk leapt up onto the Capercaillie king, who was struggling for survival under the cumans, drilled his horns into the Capercaillie's plumage, and scraped the feathers from his back, scraping and scraping until his skin was bare. Holger was unable to intervene against this act of degradation, since Hugin kept a firm hold of his sledgehammer with his wing knuckle, and the sledgehammer was his only hope. Holger pulled and pulled, but it could not be budged. He howled in despair, seeing the hare-elk pressing his hoof against the Capercaillie's neck, bending down, piercing the neck with his red and white teeth, and tearing off a piece of flesh. The humans slit open the bird's slender breast with their paws, and the hare-elk then stamped his hoof right through the Capercaillie's body. Hugin now lunged straight at the Holger's left hand, the one with the amputated ring finger, and bit hard. The pain in his scarred finger stump was so sharp that he lost grip of the sledgehammer. Down into the mud, in the middle of the meadow, with the clawing craving for vengeance in his chest. This craving was also waging a battle under the command of its own master, but to no avail, for it would never win any victory, with Holger now being taken prisoner in his turn. His nostrils were making bubbles in the mass of mud, and he was unable to move any longer, and he howled. But his howling only made more bubbles in the mud, and he was pressed down deeper into the mud by the cumans. But he was not afraid at all, for he thought that his daughter might be lying on top of him. The bloody mass of mud was now full of sledgehammers. The battle was lost. The Capercaillie king had been slain by the hare-elk. His breast lay there, ripped open, weighed down by a sledgehammer of stone, symbolizing Hugin's victory. Holger's back had been perforated by the cuman's claws, and in a way it had felt as if these hairy beasts had riveted him in their clawing clutches to protect him. One of them had apparently been his daughter, and it had struck him that he had in actual fact been lucky. He had never felt his daughter so close to him. Even though Elizabeth would probably have preferred another word than lucky, Holger had been convinced that the warm body of his daughter had been embracing him, while the forest dust had been slowly falling down on top of them, on Ragnhild's meadow, and he had thought that he had actually been lucky.